was the sort of revolutionary changes going on in Afghanistan to what was going on in Turkey. I mean, Ataturk had sounds like he had very much the same sort of attitude toward modernity. Is there a semblance?
Yeah, completely. It was the same. It was the same impulse. It was the same program. It was the same energy. It was the same everything. Ataturk also was a radical, suddenly changing my whole country guy. You know, he did things like he turned mosques into stables, and he prohibited religious headgear. Amonullah did that too, actually. And he changed the supposed day of rest, or holiday, or whatever you call it, from Friday, which is when the big Muslim prayer happens, to Sunday. And so he did all those kinds of things. But he made it work in Turkey. He made it stick. And when Amonullah started his reforms, his mentor, his father-in-law, said, you should learn from Ataturk. First build your military strength, then do your reforms. And don't do the reforms all at once. Do one, see how it goes, and if there's resistance, you got your military, and make it happen, and then go the next step. Amonullah and Surayya was very much involved in that. These two guys, the man and the king and the queen. They're like, oh, you stuffy old fool. That was the old days. This is the new days, and they didn't listen to him. So they went down. The other guy that was like that was Reza Shah in Iran. Had that same set of ideas there. So this was happening in a whole belt of countries. Yes.
You mentioned Persian Afghanistan poetic tradition. How did that divide up? Or is the poetic tradition still pretty much parallel?
Any Iranians here? Most Persian poetry actually was written in Afghanistan. But you have to realize it wasn't Persia and it wasn't Afghanistan. I overstated for drama. There were periods of Persian literature, and one of the main periods was the school that happened in northern Afghanistan, which is an area called Khorasan. So a lot of the great poetry was written there. The Persian epic, Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, that was written in Ghazni, a city about a couple hours drive now from Kabul. And it was written in the court of a Turkish king who ruled Afghanistan around 1000 AD from his capital in Ghazni. Now the story has it that the king promised him a piece of gold for each couplet, and that poet said, I guess I'm not done yet. And he went back and he wrote. And then when he finally presented the thing to the king said, oh, did I say gold? I meant silver, one piece of silver. So that poet got pissed off, and he went to the king of Persia and said, would you like to pay for this? And they bought it, and that's the Iranian epic now. But there were no borders. It was a culture region at that time. Rumi, the poet that many of you may have heard of, he's really the greatest mystic poet in literature. I think there's no touching him on that. And he was born in Afghanistan, and then the Mongols were coming, and they were intimidated, and his family moved to Turkey. And Turkey is where he did his work, and Afghanistan is where he was born and spent his childhood, and Iran was a place he passed through. And I think there's a Motel 6 someplace to stop for a night. But, I'm sorry. You can see I feel a little touchy about this. Yeah, back there.
So Amanullah and his successors tore the burqas off the women. Then the Russians came, and they left like the British. And the Taliban came, and they're going to try to put the burqas back on the women. And can you predict Do you have any feelings?
Well, you know, in the 40 years, more than 40, from 30 to 78, how many is that? I've lost track. I'm not looking now. It's around 40 years. In that period of time, the burqa was on its way out in Afghanistan. But it was, in that period, it was not legislated. In that period, the royal family took the lead and said, we don't find that the burqa is actually in the Sharia, it's not in the Quran, it's not in any of the religious scholarly works. So we're not going to have, you know, the women of the royal family are not going to wear it. And then there was a discouragement of the burqa, and you know, they controlled the bureaucracy. They didn't control Afghanistan, but they had a big bureaucracy, and people in the government bureaucracy also then started following suit. One of those people was my father, you know, and my father was the guy who led the way on coeducation in Afghanistan by agreeing to have his daughter, my sister, be the first girl to attend the school with boys. And then other people did it too. So gradually these changes were coming about. And in that period of time, there were strong feminist activist women who were operating in Afghanistan. You know, they were well known to the public. They were writing books. They were running girls' schools, and coeducation was on its way. All that stuff was happening in that period. When the Russians came, that modernization program was pushed much harder, much faster by, I shouldn't say the Russians, first of all. In '78, an Afghan communist group overthrew the monarchy and took over. And, you know, I think they were not, that was not the Soviet takeover. Those were Afghan guys. And it was also, you know, may I say, it was not a revolution, because it wasn't the poor rising up against the rich or anything like that. It was one faction of the elite grabbing the levers. Those were the part of the bureaucratic, technocratic class of Kabul. And they were not royal family, but they were people who had come up into this bureaucracy. And, you know, one of those main guys, his father was a leading general for the prime minister who ruled the country. So, you know, he was not exactly, you know, a nobody. He wasn't a street guy. So the coup was a P-U-T-S-C-H. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. What is that? Anybody know? Putsch? Okay, it was that inside the ruling class of Afghanistan. And those guys had the idea, we got to do this thing fast and do it now. So they pushed these reforms in an extreme fashion, and within, you know, 9 months, they already were encountering resistance, and they met it you know, quite predictably. When a group of, say, 5,000, 6,000 people take over a country, the population of which is, you know, 16 million, and they're doing something that most of those people are against, they immediately find their backs against the wall, and they're facing dangerous situation. Their instinct is to meet it with such force that nobody will question them. I remember before that communist coup, my cousin in Afghanistan, he was saying, you know, the ruling family, they rule, and people are down with that. Because they're kind of used to those guys. They figure, okay, they're the ruling family, they should rule. But if they're ever knocked out, the next people who come in, they better have their guns ready, and they're probably going to hit Afghans so hard nobody will know where it was coming from. Because if the ruling family goes, every Afghan will think, why shouldn't I be king? Why these guys? So, you know, the communists who took over faced that, and there was other problems. So because they couldn't hold on, and because they couldn't govern, then the Soviets came in. And when the Soviets came in, they firebombed the country, basically. You know, they depopulated it, and they destroyed the social fabric. So that was a catastrophe. And it was a delayed response. It was the Amanullah and his downfall story. That was a miniature version, This took 40 years of I'm on a law, and then it's like 40 years of the reaction. Now we're in there, and we're also legislating the social changes, and I don't know what's going to happen. Anyone who says they know what's going to happen is not to be trusted. You guys may have heard, I forget who the scientist was, some scientist said, if you understand quantum mechanics, you don't know enough about it. So Afghanistan is like that. Any other questions, or should we start signing? Yes.
Yeah, just recently, 2 women were murdered by what they call the Taliban.
Mm-hmm.
And that were helping, they were doing work to help other people. And I'm just wondering, do you have any comments to make about the Taliban as one, and why they would take on 2 women who are trying to help people through medical reasons? They were helping them.
Are you talking about the thing that happened today, or are you talking about like last month that was at
just
school?
Just past week.
Well, in the tribal belt, or whatever you call that area, there's an area that used to be running down the middle of it was the Durand line, which was the specific border between 2 nation states. In the course of all these wars, that line is dissolved, and there's this zone there, this tribal belt zone, that isn't really part of either country, and it's not a country either. It's just sort of what do they call it? Failed state kind of belt of land. And when you say Taliban, what you're referring to really is the extreme right end of a continuum of culture, and so power issues are all tied up in the conflict here, and those extreme reactionary right wing, in the Afghan context, right wing guys out in the insurgency, they profit from a situation in which a central government does not control anything, and they come out of a culture in which some power relationships were established beyond doubt, one of which was men rule women. And so everything that mitigates the social forms, everything that has the tendency to erode those social forms threatens their power, and they're going to fight it. Now, in this new insurgency, going back to say 2006, last 6-7 years, because they're not organized. This is like a demographic, but there's a certain environment in which some kinds of dangerous fish can swim, and they in the period when Afghanistan fell apart, it was a ruined territory. It was a failed state. It was a place where bands of guerrillas, all men without families, were just roaming the landscape. In that environment, some people prosper and some people don't. And the people who prosper are those who are more ruthless, more brutal, more violent, more, So those guys would like to restore that environment, or keep it that way if they can. And the dynamic is that if you're trying to create a society that's governed by rules and is orderly, and people can predict the future and stuff, there's nothing sudden you can do that can turn that around. It's a slow process. It's a drip, drip, drip process. You build a school, repair a road. Vaccination is part of that. It's like that's a program that's been going on, and healthcare workers have been going out and vaccinating children. But if you want to destroy the equanimity that underlies that kind of order, your job is much easier. You kill a couple of people who are giving vaccines and everybody's traumatized. It doesn't matter that they were helping people. What matters is that traumatizes people. One of the first of these of the new insurgency actions that took place in that same Ghazni province that I mentioned earlier was the assassination of a French refugee aid worker who was working to resettle internally displaced people in that part of Afghanistan, and was very popular, you know, with the local people. They wanted what she was doing, they valued it. And when these insurgents murdered her, your first thought would be, wasn't that a stupid thing? They're going to turn against you now. But that's not the equation, you know. It's like at first they were shocked and horrified and hated who did it. But as more of them happened, they began to start to realize that there's a new force in town, and we better start worrying about what they're going to do. So, you know, that's how it works. All right, book signing time, eh?
Yeah.
That, have I?